Welcome, fool. A martyr's death. You will sit with the saints among the elect.
Okay, I think we'll begin. So thanks everybody for coming back. As I mentioned before, what we've got now is a panel discussion, and I'm going to reintroduce Bob Fischer to you, who's going to introduce the panel to you. The format is this will last around about an hour. Bob's going to put some questions to the panel, then there's the opportunity for you to ask your own questions. So as I said earlier, think of questions. As I said earlier, make sure they're questions though. So think of some questions and then we'll hand back to you. So Bob, over to you for now.
Thank you very much, Russ, and thank you everybody for coming today. Okay, let's go around the circle of power, as we're calling it. So we have, you've met some of these fine people already. So to my left, we have Dr. Derek Johnston from Queen's University in Belfast. Next on the panel, we have the writer of the extraordinary and wonderful folk horror film Blood on Satan's Claw. Robert Wynne-Simons is with us today, which is tremendous. Gets a round of applause, and rightly so. From Sheffield, Hallam University, Dr. Diane Rodgers, who you've met today already. Are we doing rounds of applause? I kind of feel like we should. No, have a round of applause, Diane. Take it. I guess some of you may have been here last night and seen The Last Sacrifice, wonderful new documentary, and we have the director, Dr. Rupert Russell, is here with us. Where should we start? I'm going to start with Robert, actually. Because we're here talking about folk horror. Do you want to? There's a microphone there, Robert. Is that okay?
Is that?
Yeah.
Is that, you can hear it.
Sounding crisp and beautiful. We've spent all day talking about folk horror, and Blood on Satan's Claw is the film that now seems to be credited with actually coining the phrase folk horror. Back in the early 1970s, were you aware at all that you were tapping into any kind of zeitgeist?
Only that I was suddenly found that I was able to make a film, and that it had to be a horror film, and so it came out of my own feelings. And I know that it was in the zeitgeist of the time. And yes, the term was first used, I think, in a review about the film even before it was made. Yeah. Folk horror, and then Piers, the director, also used it later, and it sort of became attached to Blood on Satan's Claw as being folk horror because it has an element of a folk tale. Folk tales had always interested me from childhood very much. The power that they have.
What kind of folk tales did you hear as a child? Where were you? Where were you growing up?
I was growing up in London, opposite two worlds I was in. One was Cheam, which was a joke, and Tony Hancock.
Cheam.
It was Commuterville, and opposite us was a place called Nonsuch Park, which was Henry VIII's favourite place, where he flattened the village because he thought that should be the centre of his kingdom, because it had such natural power, and it is a very powerful place. There's something about it that is quite mysterious, and a lot of people I know get drawn there. It's not so well known, but he built this palace, and it's gone. When I was a school kid, digging it up.
So it was a childhood filled with strange stories, essentially.
So the strange stories across the road.
Yeah.
And the very, very ordinary life was the bowler hats and the going off to town to. That was what my father was involved in. Going up to London.
And as a film, where did Blood on Satan's Claw come from? Did you research ancient rituals?
A lot of different sources. I mean, there were three stories originally that I sort of melded into one. That was one of the things. And one of them sort of was about terrible things that children could do. And there were some rather terrible things that children were doing at the time. There were a couple of things that I could think of, where children had murdered other children. Okay. And that sort of, if we were thinking horror, that really sort of frightened me, that could happen. Where does this come from, this sort of primeval evil that comes out of people. So that, and I put that together with my own experiences of being teased at school, which happens to a lot of us, but you can see how a group of people, once they get the energy going, can become really terrible. It just needs this sort of crowd effect. And then there was the other thing which happened. I had an operation done on my foot because the doctor said I was going to lose it. Otherwise, it was very sort of. I was up in Yorkshire in Ilkley, and he said, "Okay, well we'll cut it open now." And so I was strapped to the kitchen table. And that sort of memory stuck in my mind. And then the idea of illness from inside taking you over and having to be cut out, I think came from that.
You didn't have a hairy patch on one foot.
I didn't have, but I have. I mean, it's very strange. I mean, somebody had the nickname of the devil's skin attached to them that I met. But another person I met, she was a model, and she had, I was horrified actually to see it, a patch totally of animal hair on her arm, which she didn't do anything about. I mean, what do you do? I don't know. But I didn't know that this was actually possible with a human being, but apparently it is. She's a very nice person, by the way. Nothing to do with the devil that I know of.
I do love the fact that Linda Hayden in Blood on Satan's Claw, the sign that she is at one with the devil are basically her eyebrows. She has these incredibly hairy eyebrows that have now just become extraordinarily fashionable. So I look at any young woman in the street, they've got the same eyebrows as Linda Hayden in Blood on Satan's Claw. And they're all possessed. I'm going to bring Rupert in here because... do you have a microphone, Rupert? Is there one nearby? There we go. We've talked a bit today about the 70s folk horror explosion, reflecting that zeitgeist, that very 1960s zeitgeist of suburban Wicca, of people conducting Wiccan ceremonies in their houses, in their basement flats in Notting Hill, which is an idea that you explore in The Last Sacrifice in your film. So do you draw a direct link between that explosion of interest in witchcraft and Wicca and the folk horror explosion of the 1970s?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear when you look at the sort of Mondo-esque documentaries that were made at the time, of which there are a handful. I mean, the big ones would be like Legend of the Witches, Secret Rites, Power of the Witch. There's one a bit later called, I think, New Fashion Old Religion. It was on ITV, Granada. And what we do in the documentaries, you can actually intercut the two things. You can actually intercut these documentaries with the sort of contemporaneous horror films that were made at the time. And like the costumes, the framing, the blocking of the scenes, it's all just this sort of one-to-one. There's also an argument to be made that actually Hammer had some influence on the documentaries themselves. So Secret Rites, for example, opens with a kind of mock witch murder, I think, at the beginning that looks like it's out of a Hammer horror film. But they were making this sort of so-called documentary. They were clearly also drawing on the horror movies at the time. And I think that's what I really find fascinating about about this whole period of time and the films that was made, what was happening in the UK culturally. It's not quite clear what's causing which, right? The kind of direction is not always clear. I mean, we also know famously the impact on music. I didn't go into the film as a separate subject. Black Sabbath was named after the film Black Sabbath, right? So it was, Ozzy Osbourne and his mates going down to watch these films, and Tiger, the folk horror ones, the Hammer ones, like Dracula's and so forth, and go, yeah, someone should do this in music. Yeah. And so you really have this kind of, the metaphor I like is kind of collision or kind of a tornado of sort of forces, and everyone's kind of drawing on everything. And we're never quite sure who started what. There's so much kind of cross-pollination.
And where did your interest in this stuff come from? Because the documentary is about the murder of a man called Charles Walton in 1945, who was killed seemingly in some kind of ritual ceremony, sacrifice, murder, call it what you will. Was that the starting point for you for your interest in all of this stuff?
Yeah, I first saw The Wicker Man was one of those films I'd always meant to watch and never got around to it until quite recently. I watched it in 2022. And what really struck me was the conversation towards the end of the film where Howie is kind of pleading for his life. And he's like, you know, don't you understand that killing me isn't going to bring back your apples? And I was like, God, that's just what it's like in Britain now. Everyone's just gone bonkers, you know. We've got the latest, I don't know, ever like wicker structure fucking Keir Starmer's going to come up with, you know, what they're going to say is going to solve all our problems, which you know won't. And their amount of shouting on the mountaintop's going to dissuade them. And I then talked to a friend of mine, Tim Stanley, who's in the film, he's a sort of aficionado of all things 1970s, and he said, well, you know, this was sort of based on a real murder. And so that kind of got me into the Charles Dalton story. And I think sort of quite quickly I realised that the true crime aspect of it was slightly limited. For interesting ways, right? Like the village didn't talk to the outsider policeman. So it was like, okay, well, there's a vacuum there, and then what got put in the vacuum was actually more interesting than the village itself.
Diane, have you got a microphone? It's my first question to everybody today is, have you got a microphone?
Yes.
You have got a microphone. Congratulations. There appear to be two big waves of folk horror, I think it's fair to say. The one that began in the late 1960s and continued throughout the 1970s. And then the one that began in the late 1990s and has become, I think, arguably bigger than it was in the 70s. Do you think the new wave of folk horror is different to the original wave?
Yes and no, I think.
Discuss.
Well, I think part of it, I think it kicked off because partially of a generational thing, because of some of what Derek was talking about, the kind of idea of hauntology and this nostalgia for I'm part of Generation X, that kind of group of people born between the 60s and the 80s who kind of looking back on these weird public information films and these TV shows we used to watch. And I mean, all of my research career was kicked off by a conversation with a colleague where someone said, no wonder we grew up weird. And it was kind of, there's a reason in that. So I think people of our generation, like Ben Wheatley and all those kind of directors, were looking back at their own childhoods and what had scared them, and were kind of recreating it, but kind of putting their own twist on it in a way. But to my absolute delight and surprise, kind of millennials, Generation Z, that's two different generations, I know, but the young people, it seems to have been picked up.
Anybody under 40.
Yeah, anybody under 40. It's kind of picked up. There's all these kind of TikTok, there's pagan talk on TikTok. I mean, I don't do TikTok, so I don't really understand what I'm talking about when I say TikTok. But there's witch talk and pagan talk, and I think the nature of politics and the world, people are looking for escape again, and there's all these environmental, ecological crises coming to a head as people, that kind of degree of concern was very much around in the 70s as well, and that's certainly fueled this new wave of it, I think. I don't know if I answered that, I just feel like I was rambling.
No, it's a good answer. I'm going to expand on it with Derek, actually. Do you have a microphone, Derek?
Can I steal that?
There we go.
Apologies if I start choking.
Are you all right?
I think so. Maybe I've been cursed.
So I think one of the interesting things about the new wave of folk horror and the new interest in folklore, it's still very much about harking back to the past and about an interest in the past. But it seems almost contradictory that it's now very much fueled by social media and online. Is there a contradiction there, do you think, about wanting to return and celebrate the old ways, but doing it on Blue Sky and Twitter?
Do you want the academic answer?
Yes,
or,
please.
Right, referring
no,
to...
either is fine. Whatever answer you feel is appropriate.
I think it actually, just the way you said that, it makes absolute sense to me, because what you have with social media is really strong connections and communities of interest but they're all dispersed. And so folk horror and that connection to place and identity, it becomes an imagined place and identity. And so I guess, anyone want to fund the research? I guess it's people finding this imagined thing. It's essentially, it's like any fandom. You know, people imagine themselves as a group through their Taylor Swift fandom, their fandom for a sports team. But then it's tapping into these things of the idea of there is authenticity that we can rediscover, and there's probably an awful lot of cultural appropriation going on, and bringing that together, and that's making a new identity, an identity for that group. That was a guess.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions? I feel like I've asked a lot here. If anybody does have anything they'd like to ask, feel free, or feel free to think about it, and I can carry on for a little while. Yes, no? While you think, I am going to ask Robert about another film that you made that I hadn't seen until very recently. But I'd like to ask you about The Outcasts, which has just been released. It's just come out on Blu-ray from the BFI. And it's a wonderful piece of cinema. Tell us about the background to The Outcasts, please, Robert.
Well, I was lucky enough I put forward a number of ideas to the Irish Arts Council, and I was lucky enough to get a script award to develop that. And rather than write about the troubles and the immediate things, they weren't too keen on that at the time. They latched on to something which was folkloric, but of course, whatever comes from the past actually has some relevance in the present, so that you couldn't sort of really avoid what was going on there. And it was a story that came to my mind. I just sort of saw a cottage with a woman shooing out the chickens that had taken over the living room, the living space, as it were, and who was she, and then through to the idea of her having both some backwards sort of people not regarding it as not quite normal, and also having a contact with the other world. And this comes through this strange guy called Scarf Michael, who's a wedding fiddler, who died, who was probably killed, and who has an uneasy relationship with the village, and the villages around where he was drowned in a lake, and he then, then she gains her power through him, and she begins to learn how and what power she has, and how that can affect her life and the life of everyone. And that was what the film sort of gradually grew into being. So it was a folk tale, pure and simple, but not one that I actually drew on, just one that sort of put itself together over a number of different stories.
It has a beautiful dreamlike ambience to it. And there's one sequence in particular that I really wanted to ask you about, which I think is probably the result of serendipity and sheer good luck. But there's a section in the middle where it suddenly snowed, and there is thick snow everywhere. Was that a very happy accident?
Everything that's bad has some good things about it. Yes, you don't expect snow in December in Ireland, particularly January, yes, but December. We had ours in December, and all the equipment was in the location, which is this cottage, and the cottage, you couldn't see it. It was up to the roof in snow. You couldn't get to the equipment, and so we had to stop shooting. So I had to have some rethinking. But gradually, you got the digger in and managed to get some equipment out. And when we got going again, yes, there was still some snow around, and that seems a wonderful transformation scene there.
Because I guess some directors would have thought, well, no, this is a nightmare for continuity. We can't shoot while there's snow on the ground. But you use it. Yeah. You turn it into a very dreamlike sequence.
Well, you have a relationship, I think, a director would have with the landscape around them. You can never be sure what you're going to get. So you have to be open if it's going to give you rain, to have that scene maybe in the rain, and maybe it's more effective if it's in the rain. You know, that kind of thing can happen, or the mist, Ireland gives you everything within the space of a single day. You can have snow, rain, mist, sunshine, one after the other. It was extraordinary for that, yes.
And Diane, did you play a small part in the release of The Outcasts? Is this right?
Well, I don't know about actually getting it released, but I interviewed Robert almost 9-10 years ago. Is it that long?
Where does it all go?
He was very generous with his time, gave me a lovely interview when I was doing my PhD research, and I spoke to you about The Outcasts, and I remember saying, forgive me for asking you about a film which I have not yet seen. And you very kindly sent me a homemade burned DVD copy.
Yeah, really dreadful quality, I'm afraid.
It was VHS. I kind of loved that though. I got this burnt DVD that had VHS copy of this. It was the only way to see it though.
Yeah.
And it just absolutely fell in love with it and just thought this is a beautiful, poetic film. And was writing for a cinema retro magazine at the time and just thought any small thing that I can do to champion this film, I just knew that folk horror fans would just get it and love it, and gave the BFI a little prod here and there and tried to help track down the print, and they obviously had to mull it over for a few years, but I'm so absolutely delighted that it's getting the attention it quite rightly deserves.
Well, you did quite a lot. I mean, you know, that was putting it to the BFI, to whatever other sources that to actually get it done. I mean, that's what it needed, and you provided it at a time when there was very little interest in it. Really, it was forgotten, and you know that really helped bring it alive again. Yes.
Has it been nice to have it reappraised, Robert, and out there again?
Yeah. Oh, it was. I mean, the reviews the second time around were incomparable to the first. The first could be terribly dismissive. Oh, a fairy tale, but the second time, it's different. People awoke to it and said, "This is a dream. This is something that's actually takes you over if you want to let it." And that was really great to hear that. People saying that was really, yeah.
Good to hear.
Well, two main performances are just so good.
Yes.
The Mary Ryan and Mick Lally. They just made that film really. So.
If you happen to get the Blu-ray, I was also delighted to be asked to do the DVD commentary as well, which has been a dream of mine since I started that was the first DVD commentary I've ever done, so that's a thing off my bucket list.
Are you doing a commentary on The Last Sacrifice, Rupert?
I don't know. We haven't talked about it maybe. Although I think I might get some witches to do the commentary.
Oh, you should!
Yeah, I can get Janet or... There's a lot of people I can pick on. You Jolie and Janet can do one.
Janet
A kind of counter commentary. They can slag it off, say like what they want.
Stop getting witchcraft wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Is Maxine Sanders still with us?
She is, but she's not doing many interviews anymore.
Is she not?
I did reach out to her, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. She's moved on. She's moved on from the basement.
I think she's still a
of
witch
Nottingham.
though. I think they mostly stuck to it, that crowd of people.
Yeah.
Amazingly, 50 years later, they're still going strong on that one.
Any questions? Yes! In the middle.
Thank you very much. I have a question on on the issue of the folk horror and the projection of national minorities and ethnic minorities in the different countries. Because when there was a discussion about how the folk horror started, one of the things that came to my mind were two things. One, was the decolonization, and therefore also the loss, if we want, of that possible dream imaginary that came from Africa and etc. And the need also to substitute that one, and I don't know if a new industrialization that maybe created that kind of let's say distinction between the urban life and the mythological. So basically, in the moment where you were losing the strange that was, let's say, in another continent, you were rediscovering the one that you had on your backyard, but that were basically the Celtic heritage. So my question is, how do you think that there is an element of, let's say, internal, let's say, colonizing attitude in terms of, for instance, the Celtic minorities, the Welsh and the Scottish, and how do you see the depiction of that kind of folk elements from, I don't know, people in Wales, from Scotland. I come from Sardinia, so it is similar also in how that is projected, this kind of, how this imagery is used there.
That's a very good question, and I will happily throw it open to anybody who wants to answer it.
I will repeat something I said last night, so apologies to those who were at the screening. But we had done there's lots of fun stuff that we did interviews on that we cut out of the film. One of the things I was looking at was exactly that question of decolonisation, because in some of the Hammer horror films in particularly, they do really focus on voodoo from the Empire, is a very important part of the story. So in The Plague of the Zombies, it's sort of voodoo from Haiti. Haiti's not British, but it was part of the Caribbean, which obviously Britain was a colonizer of, and also Kenya, which was also in The Witch is the Devil's Own. And the opening of The Witch is the Devil's Own is Jane Fontaine in quote-unquote Kenya. And it's a classroom, and she's being attacked by this like 12-foot witch doctor mask, which the props department must have kind of come up with. And the sort of story is then she then sort of flees to Britain to sort of some small town to be a teacher there, but some of this magic has kind of travelled with her. This was sort of very much linked to the so-called Mau Mau rebellions in Kenya at the time. So you look at newspaper reports contemporaneous in the 1960s, they were saying, yes, they were uprising against the British, and they were not saying this is a freedom struggle for independence and so forth. What they were saying was local population under spell of voodoo witch doctors, right? And so you kind of still saw this in the tabloids, this idea of kind of nefarious magic in the colonies are kind of turning our sort of should-be grateful subjects against us. And this just gets picked up by Hammer. I was like, that's a great idea for a horror film. Why don't we do the white woman in Kenya sort of fleeing back? On the last point you sort of said about Ireland and sort of the periphery of Britain, a lot of folk horror is set in Cornwall, right? So Cornwall, so Ritual, which is what The Wicker Man was adapted into. Wicker Man set in a Scottish island, but the original book was kind of in Cornwall, and a lot of those, The Plague of the Zombies and so forth. And the idea is that Cornwall is on that edge of empire, but I'm sure other people can speak to those things better than I can.
It is about the suppressed, I think, coming back, and the fear of what has been suppressed, what might emerge that comes out in these. That's what the horror. In the colonies, in what the church put down, in whatever it happens to be that has been suppressed and might come up, and we didn't realise.
There were also a lot of ideas, excuse me, about the Celtic fringe, the idea that it was British but not British, the idea that even I was reading in the Radio Times, the TV listings magazine, for I think the article was from the 1930s about Halloween, and it says, Halloween is not thought about much these days, apart from in some of those remote parts of the country. And there is always that sense of remote parts of the country as places where traditions get preserved. And I think that's what part of what I'm thinking about in terms of this. Yes, there is a horror in these identities, but there's also an appeal to them, the idea that they are more real in some way, that they're somehow preserved. But then you get into the issues you're talking about is it othering, is it making these people to be weird, strange people on the periphery? Or is it all actually saying these people know the truth and they are in some way a more real version of what we should be as some sort of identity? I think there's been some really interesting productions more recently which have looked at that decolonizing aspect to try to avoid that sense of, backwards rural, but also about understanding the mixing of cultures, some of which are doing consciously, like Midsummer hints at, like in The Wicker Man, this is a reinvented community, a reinvented tradition. And that directly deals with issues of like race, difference, racism. And I do think that that's one of the things that's really interesting about folk horror. And we've spoken mostly about UK version here. And it'd be quite interesting to think about what happens elsewhere as well.
Anybody else? Yeah. I think Russ is racing towards you with a microphone as we speak.
Hello, thank you for a really interesting talk. I was just wondering really actually about kind of research methods and stuff. So, for example, I had a lecture the other day about cultural heritage where, I can't remember which book it was quoted, but the idea presented was that Stonehenge had only been considered in the way in a farmer's fields since it was built, and it was never, no one actually cared about it until more recently. But then I feel like there is conflicting. I mean, you showed, I think, a text from the Middle Ages that had theories about where the stones came from and stuff. And I'm just wondering, like, where do you find the information about old folklore and stuff, or sort of maybe discovered more differing narratives about old folk stories? Is it kind of archival research, and in which case, which archives?
This feels like it's made for Diane.
It feels like it's a me question. Well, as the folklorist, folklore studies libraries, there are lots and lots of resources. I mean, like one of the things you're talking there about, there's UNESCO have recently kind of ratified this charter about intangible cultural heritage is now an important thing, and some of the research projects I'm involved with are able to look at that. I'm involved with a nationwide project in England called National Folklore Survey for England, and that's a really big project trying to get a snapshot of a truly diverse representation of English folklore. It's not just old white men doing Morris dancing. There's someone called Lucy Wright who runs a project called Folk is a Feminist project. Lots of things like that. So, and I'm at the Centre for Contemporary Legend in Sheffield, so we're kind of a group of folklore scholars. But I don't kind of just want to reel a list of text stuff, because that would be really dull. But if you wanted to drop me a line, I could give you a starter pack of folklore resources. But the Folklore Society in the UK is coming up to 150 years old. I'm proud to be a member of. They started in 1878. And the nature of folklore studies itself has changed, not surprisingly, over that time. Kind of ties into the previous question. Folklore studies started out very much as almost this colonialist, I can't even say the word, sorry, a bit tired, attitude of going into communities and collecting these locals' strange stories and folklore, almost in a kind of looking down upon the folk. They are the folk, we are collecting their stories. But there was a very big shift in the 50s and 60s to scholars going, hang on, we are all folk, like I mentioned earlier. We're all involved in these communities and societies, and acknowledging people's beliefs in a very different way. So not looking down upon them, but kind of acknowledging them and think, your belief is, I understand that is real for you, and let's look at why that is, rather than thinking it's a strange attitude. So yeah, there's a very long history of folklore studies. I can point you to some really useful books. A lot of North American scholars, it's been taken a lot more seriously as a discipline in North America over many years. But yeah, I'll stop there. But yeah, feel free to contact me and I'll give you a reading list.
All of that ties in quite neatly to something I was keen to ask, because actually it's something we discussed over breakfast this morning. But there seems to be, there's a divide, it seems, between what is considered to be proper folklore, as genuine centuries-old folk stories, and invented folklore that's been created in the 20th or 21st century for the purposes of fiction. And I guess this ties into Wicca as well, and the creation of the Wicca religion from the 1950s onwards. A new religion in many ways, but with references to the past. Does it matter whether stuff is genuinely old or newly created? Because everything is all stories are newly created at some point. Does it matter? Does it make a difference?
Yeah, you don't know. You don't know necessarily what actually happened. You don't really know. Still, people don't answer the question about what Stonehenge really stood for. They keep coming up with a new theory. There's been a lot of interest in archaeology. But even back in the Middle Ages, when I was looking at Ralph Strode Pearl Poet back in 14th century, he was then looking at things which came from some time before, and he's beginning to invent maybe his own stories connected with them. There's I think a place called the Green Chapel in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a burial ground of the type that you often find, overgrown with green grass. And he thinks that what can this have been, this strange place? And in another story, St Erkenwald, they found a tomb underneath St Paul's Cathedral in London, which had runic inscriptions and was obviously came from a very long ago pre-Christian time, and what this could possibly mean in terms of, and you have to, they have ideas come from that. It's all a possibility of what might have been.
Anybody want to add? You look keen, Derek.
I'm going to give what I call the classic academic answer. It depends. For the purposes of storytelling, invented tradition or reimagined tradition, trying to work out some of what these stories where we've got fragments, putting them together, that's what people do. What becomes interesting, and I think this probably from a folklorist point of view, is when people start picking up on those invented or rewritten stories and considering them now to be true. I think, Diane, you've written about M.R. James and the Crowns of Wessex.
Yeah, the Three Crowns of East Anglia is he is entirely made up, but has been entirely believed to be a true thing. But M.R. James used a lot of people think about M.R. James as the absolute kind of ultimate example of English ghost stories, but a lot of the folklore that he was a very learned folklorist and had studied Scandinavian folklore a lot, and there's a lot of Scandinavian folklore woven into M.R. James stories, but we think of his tales as very traditional English, but it's actually not at all. It's kind of as everything, it's a bit of a patchwork of lots of things. But yeah, there's a story about the Three Crowns of East Anglia, that there were these ancient kings and these buried crowns, and it's all made up, basically. But lots of people believe it.
But even if it had been,
but does it?
But even if it was centuries old, even if that story was 500 years old, it would still have been made up.
My folklorist
the only
answer
difference
to
is
this,
time.
My folklorist answer is the literal truth is not what my discipline is interested in, it's how and why that belief came to be. Yeah. So it doesn't matter to me whether the Loch Ness Monster actually exists or not. It matters to me if you believe in it, that's really interesting. I'm not going to look down upon you for that, but I'm interested in where that belief came from. So yeah.
Which is, yes, it's what people do with it that matters. The how do you use it? Are you using it to entertain, to educate, to terrify, to bring people together, to force people apart? That's the interesting bit. And yeah, looking at tradition of like seasonal ghost stories, I was expecting that to be 18th, 19th century. People keep saying, oh, it's Dickens. It's an ancient tradition, says Dickens, which you expect to mean oh, some guy in the 18th century invented it. But that one seemed to keep going back. And you get to the point where you can't find out anymore because there's no records, what you were talking about. And then, but really what matters isn't, is it really ancient? It's, if it is ancient, then it's saying something. If it's not ancient, but people believe it to be ancient, that's saying that there is a gap that they need filled, and that it's filling that gap. So it's, what's that purpose? And that's where it gets. Otherwise, it's just a yes/no question. Is this true? Yeah. No. And? And it's that and that's the interesting thing, I think.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Hold on, so everyone can hear. I'll give you one.
Ross is getting his steps in today.
So, my folklore, horror, or indeed like megaliths are unique to Britain. But is there something particular about British culture, especially in the 70s, but then still is there still fertile soil 30 years later, 40 years later? Is there something particular to British culture that made it such a kind of fertile area for folk horror, whereas, say, at the same time in Italy, it'd be like Hallam and stuff like that. So, yeah, why Britain, essentially? I mean, you can ask why Britain is very... That's just a general question.
There was one thing I would say that I mean, in Germany we had the Grimm's fairy tales in the 18th century, which awoke people to folk stories. In the 19th century in Britain, there's James Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, which awoke people to all the folk practices. And he spent all his life really putting together a compendium of all the various things, including the Wicker Man, that people did in ancient times. And that got into the imagination of writers towards the end of the 19th century, which then fermented and came out in the 20th. And it was that, I think, that started it all. I mean, there was a lot of interest in potentially what on earth, why do people do these strange things? Where does it all come from?
There's on the use question of how does it sort of all get used, it's like, sure, you've got these sort of compendiums, Grimm and so forth. There's others, you know, we could talk about like Dracula and Frankenstein, also like super rich as well. But I think with the sort of why Britain case, I think there's one archetype in particular that the way in which they're used is sort of the filter, which is enemy within, right? Like whatever it might be, whether it's sort of the Wicker Man or the Abbot Walmsley horn dance or whatever the different sort of practices are, the storytelling device is your neighbour might secretly be a devil worshipper and kill you, and that is just being repeated in film after film after film after film. And you might almost take it as axiomatic, right? You'd almost be like, well, that's just kind of what folk horror is, you know, it's about the outsider going to the village, and that, you know, the enemy isn't somewhere sort of broad or sort of foreign, it's kind of within the community, and it's that kind of paranoia that inside the community lurks the secret monster or evil, whatever it might be. American folk horror is quite different, right? So American folk horror, a lot of it's like going away. So a lot of it's like, you know, American werewolf in London, they have to come to Europe, right? You know, it's midsummer, they kind of come to Sweden, they look around Newake, they go that. Sort of Pacific Island. Even in the X-Files, they do a lot of folk horror. It's always like Mulder and Scully get in their station wagon, right? And they leave DC and they drive past the same line of trees in every episode to go to like the scary, exactly, to go to like the scary thing. And even then, they're not quite, I think often really presented as Americans. Like they could be Amish, for example, like a play on the Amish religion, or they could be like alien kind of abductees. And I think that, you know, the question may be that, you know, intrinsically to Britain, the enemy within is obviously as a metaphor for class war, right? And that's really the sort of folk horror, class war, the enemy within, like that's kind of the engine that's sort of pushing all this, and then folklore's kind of like the fuel that gets kind of pushed.
It was working classes that kept the old traditions, and therefore were a threat to the middle classes. And yes, that's a perennial thing. Yeah. I think.
There's also things like Brexit, boo, really has brought all that stuff to the surface, and has, I think, I wouldn't be surprised if that's played a big part in some of the recent things, because it, like you were saying, your enemy is literally your next door neighbour. It's 51% of the population who you fundamentally disagree with on what felt like it was really upsetting, the whole Brexit thing. It was one of the biggest politically divisive things I've experienced, and a lot of people felt genuine grief at kind of leaving Europe. I certainly did. It's kind of still would like to think of myself as European, even though, you know, I didn't want the blue passport, I want the red passport back. But yeah, that was a distinctly British thing. I don't know.
But also in America, I mean, there was a review of a book that I did of Blood on Satan's Claw in the Washington Post, and they look on, or at least the Washington Post does, what's going on in America at present as being part of the folk horror tradition. The horror coming out, because yes, you didn't, half the country, you didn't know what they were thinking. And then suddenly there comes this extraordinary character who's some kind of monster, really, who suddenly explodes. And that came out of, yes, people knew him down the street. They all voted for him.
And again, very specifically being looked at as being a populist movement, as something that's coming upwards from the folk, whilst still again being a story of the folk being manipulated through the media. But I don't think folk horror is just a UK thing. But I wonder if part of it is to do with what's now one of the sort of stereotypes of Englishness, particularly of really being very arrogant, but at the same time absolutely uncertain about the self. That imperialism, but because I'm going to go out and conquer the world because really I'm not feeling very adequate at home. And so if you look at other places which do have fairly strong folk horror traditions, or where, like, we're seeing a rise in American folk horror, I would say, it's a kind of post-imperial thing. So I'm thinking partly here of some of the Japanese films from 50s and 60s, I think, were mostly.
Yes.
So I wonder if that's a part of it. It's that the retreat from empire means you've got to look into your roots, and looking into your roots is then the monster staring back at you, and it's your own reflection.
Yeah. It's when you feel most secure. I mean, England felt terribly secure in the 1900s. It had come, and then gradually things start coming out from underneath, and then they had this great war, and the whole thing sort of exploded. They can never look at it the same way again.
We have a hand that keeps going up in the middle here.
Well, thank you very much all for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
This is a question, I think, specifically for Robert. At the time of Blood and Satan's Claw, the British Board of Film Censors were very wary of horror and the American tradition of gore horror, and I believe also very interventionists, even looking at scripts before they were made and giving advice. So it's a two-part question. Did you have troubles with the BBFC? And also, do you think, maybe a more general panel question, that framing what could in America have perhaps been a gore horror film like Texas Chainsaw or Hills Have Eyes in this very British folk horror, was that a way of appeasing the censors?
I don't know, Piers, the director of Blood on Satan's Claw, had more to do with the censor than I did. So to know, he decided that he wanted to have the rape and murder of this young girl in the thing. And surprisingly, that didn't get cut out. I never could understand that quite why. The focus was on a particular thing that they said was psychologically bad, was when the guy is going to cut his leg and he has a knife and there's a sexually alluring dance being performed in front of him. The association of sex and knives they were worried about. And all the focus went on that, and eventually they actually gave in on that matter as well. And so the film never really got substantially censored, which I don't quite know why this sometimes happens. But it certainly it didn't suffer from the censors as much as you thought it might have done. And therefore it's a bit more powerful, I think.
Was there a second part to that? Sorry.
Yes, it's just whether that framing what could have been a sort of American Herschel Gordon Lewis Gore type within folk horror made it acceptable to... Would it still have been John Trevelyan at that stage, or had Trevelyan...
It was Trevelyan at that stage.
Still John Trevelyan. Right, interesting, because he was known for having dialogues with filmmakers.
He did,
How can you make this acceptable?
I think Piers talked him round a lot of things, yes, because, yes, he could talk about what understanding, because that often happens when people understand why films get made. They realise that it isn't such a thing that should be banned, because it's part of the psyche. And that's what comes up. But and he was open to that, I have to say. That was good. In America, I don't know. Texas Chainsaw Massacre changed everything, really, didn't it? That film. And once that had gotten through, then it unleashed a whole lot of other things. It was based on a true story.
Anybody else? Yeah, down the front. It's always the person furthest away from poor Russ.
I need the exercise.
Thank you all for the talk. It's been very interesting. Maybe a paradoxical question, because obviously folk horror is very rooted in traditionalism, and I think the more popular examples now are still, their movies and books. But is there innovation in folk horror that's happening now that maybe wasn't happening 50 years ago?
As an addendum to that, I will point out that the writer, actor, director Matthew Holness caused something of a stir. Are we aware of Matthew Holness? He's Garth Marenghi. He created a fictional horror writer called Garth Marenghi, and is a fine writer and director in his own right. But just before Christmas, Matthew Holness tweeted saying, please, 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 no more folk horror. So he clearly felt that the current revival anyway had reached saturation point. What do we think?
Well, we were talking about this earlier again, weren't we, and saying there are a lot of examples of folk horror that if you've seen The Wicker Man, you know what's going to happen in this film. So there aren't a lot that I've seen that do something distinctly different, but there are those examples. That's why I think Ennismen is a really nice example. I mean, it's completely abstract and very different to typical folk horror. But there's I mentioned a film to Bob this morning called Calibre. I don't know if anyone's seen that. It's a Scottish folk horror film. And you think you've seen this film before, but it kind of you think it's The Wicker Man, but it kind of turns things on its head, and it's kind of opposite to that idea of again. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tired. I'm getting tongue-tied. It's the opposite to that kind of going into a community and going, oh, these people's beliefs are weird. It's more like you realise the community are saying, no, this outsider is strange and wrong. And it's kind of the other way around, and it's so I think there are some really nice examples. Borderlands is another one that I would recommend that is unusual and different. And if I tell you much about it, it will completely ruin the film. It's great to go in not really knowing anything, and it gets a bit silly towards the end, but it's genuinely creepy, and you haven't seen it a million times before. So I think there are interesting different versions out there that are more innovative and still feel like folk horror, but they're not doing that tick box of tropes that Bob mentioned earlier. It's not like, what do you call it, folk horror bingo. It's not ticking all those boxes. So, yeah, there are out there, but I think they're few and far between, but it's worth sticking with.
We like the bingo though, we like all the tropes.
We like the folk horror bingo.
There's something very comforting in it, I think, especially when I watch programmes and films from the 70s. I like you say, I really love the fact that they follow a format sometimes. There's something very comforting in that at times, I think. But I'm kind of interested in the way that the aesthetic of the 1970s has now become part of the folk horror aesthetic, the modern folk horror aesthetic. So we look at films like Ennis Main and Starve Acre, another new film that came out last year, and they are folk horror films, but with strong links to the 1970s. They're set in the 1970s. And they've got the look of the 1970s.
Some of them look like they were made in the 1970s.
Yes, I mean, Ennis Main is
intentionally.
shot on vintage film stock to look exactly like that. So the 70s themselves have now become part of folk horror.
I think part of that is, there's part of it is nostalgia, but part of it I think is probably an industry thing. Oh, I'm going to turn to the industry people. But
don't hold back here, Derek.
But with kind of the fragmentations of TV, and everything's going to end up on streaming and TV, so things have to be readily identifiable. And it doesn't mean that there's not interesting stuff happening, but it's the more experimental. And particularly if you're thinking about television, as Diane was talking, I was thinking, we were looking at all of these examples that Bob and Diane have been talking about that were coming from TV. Weird, just off the wall thing. I don't think you would get made today. If you get a folk horror TV program made today, it's something like, it turns out to be The Red King, which I quite liked, but which was, again, it's taking the Wicker Man template and trying to tweak it a bit. And it's the same with that, if it looks like it's from the 70s, that's part of the signal. This is how you read this. It's a folk horror film. Again, there's some which are a bit different. I'm not sure, would you call In Fabric a folk horror film?
I'd never thought of it as such.
But it's going very much that 70s aesthetic, which Strickland likes.
Loves, yes he does.
But I think it's a marketing thing, sorry.
A lot of filmmakers today are remembering what they saw as a child, and it's sort of what frightened them as a child, and that comes very evident. Yeah.
How are we for time, Ross?
Maybe time for one more question.
Concept of time.
Time for one more question.
One more question. No pressure. Who wants to ask the final question?
Make it a good one.
Yeah.
Maybe just as a final question, having seen everything today and last night, are you all right?
Thank you so much for asking.
Let's go around the circle. Rupert, are you all right?
I'm fine.
He's fine. We have established. No, were you genuinely? Because I'm part of a stage show called Scarred for Life, where we discuss all of the traumatizing things that we saw as a kid. What are your scarred for life things from being a kid, Rupert?
Oh, Alien, obviously.
So it was more science fiction than horror.
Well, I just saw it, just those films you watch when you're too young, and kind of 10. I was like, what's the egg thing? You know, it's just like, no, that was definitely mine.
Anything on TV?
Anything on TV? God, I was trying to think.
I don't know, Big Brother maybe?
Scary in a
The
different
most
way.
terrifying of all. But you are okay, we have established.
Yeah, no, like a lot of people, I kind of find horror a bit of a therapy, you know.
Yeah. It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who actually suffer from genuine mental health issues who find horror, and often quite dark horror, to be a respite from that. There's something comforting about fictional darkness that is transportative. and takes people away from real life darkness.
But good horror is also not real, right? I mean, it's got a kind of campy fakeness to it, which is, I think, often gets missed.
Yeah.
It's not dark, and that's often when you see people who get told, "Oh, you should make a horror film that's good for your career," and then you watch it and you're like, "This is just not nice." You know, as you watch films made by real horror fans, and they're fun films, right? You know, Jordan Peele just said that the other day. There's a difference between comedy and horror as a soundtrack.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Diane, are you all right?
Mostly. I just remembered when you were saying that, Rupert, there, when I spoke to Ben Wheatley, he said about Kill List, I realised I hadn't made a horror film, I'd made a horrible film. And I thought that was... And also, I'm from Sheffield, town in north of England, born and bred, where Kill List is set and filmed. Also Threads, if anyone's seen that post-apocalyptic, my hometown gets blown up in that. The Full Monty is also in Sheffield, if you've seen that, about unemployment. I have to say, Sheffield is actually a really nice place.
It is.
It's not like folk horror would have. It's one of the greenest cities in England. You know, we're not constantly ducking nuclear bombs and ritual murder.
I mean, bloody hell, I'm from Middlesbrough. We look at Sheffield and think, oh, I'd love to live there.
They must be really hard.
Exactly. Robert, are you all right?
I think I'm my judge, but I think horror has something of a therapeutic quality for some people, definitely, and people get drawn to it who've had terrible experiences. I mean, a number of the people who came to see a thing of the Blood on Satan's Claw were actually coming in wheelchairs. And we had a problem because the French Institute, when it was shown, didn't have any access to wheelchairs, but they climbed up the stairs, you know, hands and to get to see these films. And it's a sort of thing. I mean, I also have the example of a friend of mine, Ingrid Pitt, who was an actress. She began life in a concentration camp. She really went through hell. And somehow she got drawn to, you know, becoming Countess Dracula. I think it can help some people. Others might not.
No, I think you're right. I think it can be very therapeutic.
Derek, are you all right?
Apart from this cough, which I hasten to add is just a bit of dryness, this is not the start of Survivors.
Do I need PPE?
No, I'm not, as you could possibly have told from my talk earlier. But what I find interesting and useful is talking about these things and thinking about them and about the stories we tell and how they are useful to us. That idea of horror as a metaphor, as a way of dealing with things at a slight distance. Of course, then getting too frightening when it gets too real. You didn't ask about the scars, but one of mine, Legend of Boggy Creek. I don't know if you remember that. It would turn up on the BBC Two horror series, and the thing that scared me about it was that it said it was a true story, and I'm not sure I'd call it a folk horror story, but it has some of the elements because it is very much about landscape. It is about a mythical creature, and it's about how people respond to it. But the fact that it was supposed to be true and the way that it was shot really low budget, almost like basically it's a mockumentary, terrified me. But it's going back to that thing of what's true, what are stories, how do we use them? And that's part of what set me on this delightful route of happiness, joy, and frivolity that I embody today.
And on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much. Well, thank you to all of you for coming along today and for asking some terrific questions. Give yourselves a round of applause for that. Thank you. And say a huge thank you to all of our panel as well, to Rupert, to Diane, to Robert and to Derek. Thanks everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Mutual appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, as well. It's not an easy thing to do, so thank you. Yes, just to echo that, really, big thank you to all of you. You had a choice of where to be today, and you chose to be in this wonderful cinema. So thank you all very much, and hopefully we will see you for a beer in the bar very soon. But yeah, big thank you. Thank you very much.